Okay. So the first real question that I ask in general is, who was Laura Perls in your experience of her? Who was she to you?
Well, after working with Richard Kitzler for I can't remember how many years, um, he had suggested that I go into to work with Laura a bit. Um, I had begun to go to institute meetings by then. They were all, I think, once a month on Wednesday night, and Laura had done one which she published called "Every Life Story Is Not Worth a Novel." That's not quite the title. It's in a book that the woman you just mentioned edited, and and it was very funny and it was very good. And I, as a literature major, I saw had a lot of the literary references I knew. Um, So anyway, I did. I called her, and I think I used Cindy's name, and then Richard's and so forth. And so I went to the group. One of the things I wished, besides this intuition I had later, that she would have been very helpful to me in my late 20s. Um, I had been to a therapist in high school, a psychoanalytically oriented therapist, who was a good guy, but I felt like it didn't really do what I needed. But I was really broke in the late 20s. I was out of work, living in the Lower East Side from menial jobs, and I thought I wanted to be a writer, a film director, and so forth. And what I intuit later, Laura would have pulled me out of that funk. And she might have sent me on into the movies much earlier than when I wound up doing it at 60. Um, uh, I can't tell you why I think I know that. I did send, there was a client of mine who I called me much later and I said, why don't you go see Laura? And she was a young actress as well as a teacher. And she actually put this woman in touch with Judith Molina, who was one of the, uh, what was the avant-garde theater troupe? Oh my God, this probably too young for this. The Open Theater. Judith Molina, and I can't remember his name. And that whole open theater crowd, this is another story that might interest you someday. They were all in therapy with the Gestalt people. They were either with Fritz or they were with Laura, some of them were with Paul Goodman, some of them were with the others. And her husband, the husband of Judith Molina, was with Laura because she talked to me once about a session that he had done. Um, And that was the kind of thing Laura would do. She would pinpoint, she was very practical. She had practical ways. And if she could help, she would say, go there, or why don't you investigate this? In other words, that famous therapeutic distance was not there in that way. In other ways, it was very much there. But the other thing I wished was by the time I got to Laura, she didn't do that much physical work anymore. Um, One session in the group, she worked with me on my posture and my breathing. And I stood up and she did certain things and had me do certain things. And I realized when I would talk to people who had worked with her 20 years before, she did that a lot and actually was very helpful. And I thought, oh, it's too bad that she doesn't quite have the energy, obviously, to do that kind of work anymore. Um, Anyway, it was with a very the group has a very intelligent group of people, and it was a good group. Every once in a while, she'd get angry at the group. She'd suddenly say, "Oh, you all bore me," um, uh, which was kind of fun. Um, so we'd all get a little tense, but she then quickly moved through it. Uh, so um, she was she was able to make me begin slowly to come out. I mean, Richard Kitzler was the one who really, in some ways, put me together. Um, but Laura was, and I was, part of the problem for me was that when I was the worst learning disability in my high school. because the dean told me 5 years later when I bumped into him on the Jersey Shore. And I was terribly dyslexic and still am. And she was able to work with that. She didn't, there was no attempt to analyze that. This was who Eric was. And so we try to work with this and get him to breathe into just speaking. And so I was actually very relaxed around, I was relaxed around her and really looked forward to her. I had the experiences I was going to share with you. One of them is wonderful and one of them is sad. I bumped into a 72nd Street between Broadway and Central Park West. Was in the old days meaning the 50s, right after the war into the 50s, was filled with almost Viennese type coffee shops. It was a Jewish world from Europe. And there were a lot of Jewish immigrants from the war. And of course, that was the whole history of the New School and Hannah Arendt, people coming in from Europe. And Laura was a part of that world, I think. She came in much later than they did, but she knew some of them. Anyway, there was a movie theater around the corner, and I was a cinephile. The whole late 50s explosion in European cinema hit me. I loved it. And so I went a lot. And I went to this movie by Andre Victor called A Love in Germany. I don't know if you've ever seen. You know who he is? He's one of the great Polish film directors. And he then made a movie outside of Poland called A Love in Germany about a Polish guy who was the Nazis had arrested. And he now, 40 years later, comes back with his young son to search for the German woman he had the illegal affair with. So I saw this movie and I thought it was great. And I'm walking up 72nd Street and there's Laura. And she's just going into one of the coffee shops and she had seen the show before I had. So I said, that's what I saw. And she said, wasn't it wonderful? So then we walked into the coffee shop and we had a long talk about that film and about, movies in general, cinema in general. But about this particular film, she had really been moved. And we talked about a particular erotic moment in it. The young Polish prisoner is walking, she is attracted to him, and he's walking from one room to the house. He's assigned to a farm, not a concentration camp. He's assigned to a farm because he's not Jewish, but he's a prisoner of war. And she sticks out her leg in front of him, bare leg. It is an incredibly erotic moment. And Laura was really taken with that moment. I was a little hesitant to talk about that, but she wasn't. And so that led to the whole business of the war. As you know, she went to South Africa. She couldn't stand her mother. Her mother wanted to come. She didn't want her mother to come. And then the mother perished. And that led into that whole history, which I didn't know about. Later in the group, she actually talked about that because there was another European client. Actually, what had happened was, this is what happened. In our group, people would sometimes come in from Europe or from South America for a year. They came into New York for some reason. There was a very interesting woman from Argentina who came in, who then told this horrendous story during the military occupation, that she was doing a group therapy, and these cops came to the door looking for somebody who was one of her clients. And they took him out and they shot him in the street. And so telling this was really, for us, and that led to Laura talking about that whole experience. and how the guilt she felt about never bringing her mother. And that also came out that day in talking about a love in Germany. We had few moments like that. There was a funeral we went to. May have been AIDS. It was on the east side, and she and I walked through Central Park back to her apartment. We didn't have any profound discussion. We were talking mostly about AIDS and about the devastation and so forth. I experienced her in these moments as actually quite warm. And honestly, I actually experienced that in the therapy group too. I didn't experience that. Some of the complaints that people made, she was a little cold or off distance. She was obviously incredibly well read and very bright. And I shared certain German novels with her, Sleepwalkers by Hermann Brock and The Man Without Qualities by Robert Musil, which I had studied. And she was particularly interested that I knew about Brock. The sad one is at the end. I never quite understood. They were running out of money, and she was, I guess, being asked to leave the apartment in Central Park West. So the group broke up, and I went to the bathroom. And most of the group had gone on the elevator, and she heard me come out and said, "Eric, come on back here." So I came back to the office. There was the group was here, and then the office was around the corner. The rest of the apartment was down there. And so we sat, and she took my hand, and we sat next to each other. And then she said, "I don't want to go. I just don't want to go." And I didn't know quite. Of course, I didn't know what to say, but the therapeutic training came in, which was, if you don't have anything to say, you don't say it. You just sit with her and hold her hand and try to work through it. But it was heartbreaking. She didn't want to leave the clients. She loved the group. She loved New York. She didn't want to go back to Germany. And so we sat there for about a half an hour. Then I had to go back to Brooklyn. That was the last time I saw her. And then I heard she'd gone to Germany, and then I heard she didn't live that much. I can't remember how long it was that she was there.
Yeah, it sounds like a very sad way to say goodbye.
Yeah. And the group was still going on for a couple of months, and then it was split in June, and then that would be it, I think, for the summer. And of course, I had no sense that this was goodbye, but it was. Yeah, You're right.
Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering about her work. Some people have very clear memories of certain moments in session or in group, and I wonder if any of those come to mind.
I don't. There was once where she confronted me directly about why I wasn't able to write. And she kept saying, "You don't produce anything." And she could be direct like that after a certain period of time. There was like, and she could do that with certain people in the group. Mostly, she let the group. Well, this is kind of interesting. I had come from a group therapy myself with my original therapist. And that group was run as an interactive group that we'd all sit around. Let's say you had a problem, and then I would come in with it, and empathy and so forth. And then when I came into my first Gestalt group with her, I did that with someone, and one of the people got outraged because, let's say it was your problem, they were supposed to work with you, and the group was supposed to work with you. And I thought, what's the point of that? I thought the whole point was that the group therapy with everybody talking, all the projections and stuff would come out. But I was intimidated. Well, I just said, "Okay, shut up. It's my first group. let this thing go. Um, and later, she still would ask people to do things. And I always felt people would say, well, I have a dream. And I never quite believed that that's what they really wanted to work on, quite frankly. They were a little frightened to work on what they really wanted to work on, but they did have a dream. So they would work on the dream and she'd do the dream work with them. But eventually the group did become more interactive and she just would watch it and say certain things from time to time. But she did try in the theory, to bolster the ground that you stood on and to kind of honor that ground and then move out of the ground.
Another thing that I do ask is how you have noticed or felt or understood her influence on you or on your work.
Laurel would work on small points. I got angry at my cat this morning and I hit the cat. So that never happened. But as opposed to, I'm in love with my mother and I hated my father and you'd work and then you'd work on the feelings about that particular moment. And she was actually very patient in those moments. And that was very important to me because I began to work that way myself. Also, I really was someone who really tried as hard as I could never to make a judgment or to give advice. She might give advice, but I always felt like the idea was to try to create the conditions for the client to make his own or her own decision. And so to try to stay away from that. In some ways, even though she sometimes would give advice, that's also how she worked. And I always felt like there was a part of her that felt that people had an inner strength in them that they didn't always call on, but they had it. The it being the strength. And to have faith in that strength and to try to get them to have faith in that strength. And I will tell you, by the way, in making 2 movies, that working with actors, that was a very important thing. No joke. Because actors are even the best ones. I just made a movie with Danny Glover, and they're still very, very few of them are sure of themselves. And so it's looking to try to get that strength. So yeah, that she was very good at that. I forgot about that. So she'd again work on small moments with people, and not necessarily the big moments of the thing. Just working on these small moments and having a lot of patience with them.
But, how do you think Laura would have understood the transcendence in Gestalt therapy? How do you think, or do you think she would have imagined it where we are now? I mean, do you think she knew the value of what they were creating? Do you think she
That's
just
without a
imagined the
doubt.
directions it's gone?
No. The value, she was absolutely convinced that they had made with Paul Goodman, who she really liked. With Fritz, who she would talk about Fritz as being a real genius. And despite whatever happened there, he was one of the forward-looking people. She compared him to Abraham Maslow, Wilhelm Reich, the orgone, when we were putting down the orgone box, and she was saying, these people are geniuses. And I don't know if there's an orgone box, but I give them the benefit of the doubt. So yeah, she was convinced and knew, more than just convinced, in her bones, muscles, as she would say, in her muscles. That's what Paul Goodman would say. In her muscles, she knew that Gestalt therapy had made a major advance. Now, I don't know what you mean by transcendence. I still meet people who have no idea what it's about, including therapists that I meet up here who are retired. They'll say, well, what is Gestalt? So I have to answer this question. I talked to a couple of people in Europe, and it has a strong foothold in Europe. It still, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't have that strong input in America. But I don't hear the problem was, even then they knew the problem was that people were taking the techniques and not the theory behind it. That was the old complaint. So Fritz Perls would do these films, and they'd see him do the empty chair, and they'd say, "Oh, that's how you do it," and without knowing what was the theoretical part behind it. And very few people actually read Gestalt therapy. They owned it, but I'm not sure that they read it. And then Paul Goodman himself was a very controversial figure for all kinds of reasons. I met him once politically, and I wanted to kill him. um, um, but she was very clear that Goodman was a major intellectual figure and had made a real contribution, not only in Gestalt, but in literature. I mean, he did write great short stories. I'm not sure his novels were that good, but his short stories were great, and his essays were great. So, I mean, that was the original bunch, and that was a wild bunch. You know, they argued and fought all the time, and I felt like Laura would stay out of those arguments. I mean, she certainly did when I was there. What would happen when I was there was that Richard Kistler and Isidore Fromm were on opposite sides of all these issues, and they would talk a lot, and everybody got a lot out of it. You can talk to Joe about that. He's very good about that, what that was, because he was there before I was. And then they'd scream at each other, right? And then the meeting would come in, they all go out and get drunk. They all get drinks together, right? Now that was as an intellectual style in the 50s. It was mostly Irving Howe and Dwight MacDonald. I don't know if you know who these people are. They were literary political figures. Dwight MacDonald was very important for the Perls is because they had read his magazine Politics in South Africa. It was a quarterly. And he was responsible for getting Fritz in here. And then Fritz got Laura in. So Dwight MacDonald, she used to say that Dwight MacDonald was a very important figure for them, even though she didn't always agree with him about literature. He was one of the key figures that got them out of South Africa when they wanted to come here. I think that she thought they would eventually go in some of the mainstream, and that's actually what has happened. You know, when you talk to young kids, they don't really. There are people who go to the Institute. I know that. I know that Gap has a full program, and there's another one. But all these other, what Isidore Fromm would complain about, Gestalt and couple therapy, Gestalt and psychoanalysis, Gestalt and this, Gestalt and that, and a lot of the new. I even took training in it myself. I always go like that with the eyes. What is it? You know what I mean?
EMDR.
EMDR, right. I did EMDR training a bit at the end. So I don't know what I think she thought Gestalt would win in the sense that it would eventually take its place in the mainstream because she was so sure that what they were talking about and what were the deficiencies in psychoanalysis, if you want to use that word, was there. And they had taken the psychoanalytic model and built on it. And Reich was in there too. It's interesting because I'm rereading The Mass Psychology of Fascism right now. And so I'm thinking about how they talked about it back then. It's very interesting to read it then, now. But there's certain things that Reich still was very sharp on. The authoritative family structure, the idealization of motherhood, and how that played into the structure of the Third Reich, and how they played it together, and how the Catholic Church came in a very unusual way. So anyway, actually, I'm getting a lot out of it.
Good. Except for the nightmares, but yeah.
Right.
So you mentioned South Africa a couple of times. Did Laura ever talk about that? Did she talk about the time in South Africa? Because that is sort of like the dead end that I've hit. I haven't found anyone who was with them, who knew them, who met them, who worked with them there.
I certainly didn't know anybody. myself who work with them. They love Smith, the South African, the head of South Africa at that time, who wrote an important book which influenced Gestalt therapy because of the holistic approach. I don't know how she dealt with the racial situation. You know, she did say to me they had black servants. And she actually would say positive things about it for the kids in terms of the environment where they lived, and there was a field and so forth and so on. As you have probably discovered, Steve took a very different direction than Laura did. That's really interesting. I met Steve a couple of times. There was a birthday party for Laura that went sour because she got hit. I don't know if they told you this. It was one of the first times I was there. It was the New York Institute decided to do a conference around Laura's birthday. And she had went out to get a dress, and she got hit by one of those racks that take dresses, because it was in the garment district, and she really got hurt. I think she broke her leg or something, so she couldn't come. And so it was a funny conference. But Steve came. I don't even think Renata was there, but she must have been there. And Steve came, and I met him, and he came a couple of times, and he was very sweet, but he was very clear that he was not a Gestalt therapist. He didn't go for that. He was an analyst. Now he was in psychology, which was interesting. But you're right. She didn't really talk about it a lot. And it was more that time when she did not want her mother to come. I got the feeling that Fritz would have let the mother come. He was not opposed to the mother coming. But Laura did not want her there. And then, of course, she went to the camp. So, but you're right. Here's another thing that's interesting. One of the questions that people wanted Laura to write more. And it's interesting that she would say to me, Eric, why don't you produce? When she wrote very few things. Now, what she said about it was that she would, I thought of another story, I'll get a kick out of it, but she would walk around the house thinking about the article. And she'd think about it for about 3 months. And then the few times she went down to write, it came out very quickly. So she obviously had a style that was, I mean, she was an A student in the gymnasium, you know, one of the few women who was in so the style probably came to her, but she didn't write that much, you know. She did the oral history, which is in that little book with Isidore and everybody else, but people always wanted her to write more. The thing I suddenly remembered, we came into the group and she sat down and she said, you know, I couldn't sleep last night, so I turned on the television, and there was Casablanca. And she said, what a great movie this is. And she then said, the reason it's great is because of the ensemble acting, the way the actors played it. She's absolutely right about that, because visually it's not that interesting, but it's the way the actors work off each other. And she talked about that. And then she made a reference to the romance of Ingrid Bergman somehow, you know, escaping Europe, going with him, and then going back, and you know the story and so forth. But I remembered that. I remember, and she really got such a kick out of it. She just really loved it. So she also, of course, loved classical music. I think she was a pianist. She grew up with all that. And my father was a music teacher, so we had a little of that in common too. So, yeah. I don't know if this is helpful at all, but
Oh no, I'm really appreciating what you're saying.
okay.
Just wondering, do you have anything else that comes to mind right now, or do you want to leave it here? I guess I would ask actually how you are feeling just right now, bringing Laura back in to have this conversation. What are you left with?
You know, Heather, what I'm left with is this kind of fantasy regret that I didn't work with her privately. Even later, if I had worked with her privately, although by that time, I'm not sure she would have even been able to do the physical work anymore. But I really feel like I blew it in my I feel that anyway in my late 20s. But I feel like Laura would have been better all the way. And I say that because I don't think Richard and Isadore would have been so good with someone who was where I was then. They would have been a little bit too dictatorial. And I would have probably not understood Richard at all. Richard was pretty wild. But he and I became very, very close. And by the way, Laura really liked Richard. I mean, she favored Richard's ideas more than she favored Isadore's. That I will say. And she did say to me she said to the group once, "Look, I'm intimidated by Richard Kitzler too." So, because Richard was incredibly intelligent. So that's what's coming up for me. This feeling like I wish I had had more of her, and I wish I had had her in my late 20s when I really needed it.
Okay. Well, thank you. Is it okay if I
Okay.
stop us here?
All right.